Welcome to our next video, which will provide some helpful background information about the exile of God's people, which shaped the message of God's prophet in the book of Jeremiah. This is part of a Bible reading plan with Anthem Church, and today's video is from a discussion I led a few years ago and is edited to provide you with the essential content to help you better understand what is going on in these foundational chapters. So let's get started.
With Daniel and Esther, we read about these new world powers, and I think this is really important for us to understand that they're not only major antagonists in the story, but they mark a significant change in Israel's adversaries. And so, until this point, when you think about the Canaanites and the previous battles, those are largely smaller tribal battles. And so, now with Assyria and Babylon and Persia, Israel is encountering major world powers in opposition to God's people. And so when we think about this Assyrian Empire, they covered a lot of land. And so this is an image that shows that. There's Judah on the bottom. But as they conquered nations, they were doing it to expand their reach. It's kind of like what we think about in the significance of like World War I or World War II. Like a major shift is happening in the story. And we read about this in 2 Kings 17 that I'm just going to put on the screen there. But notice that key phrase, they were deported. And so when Assyria conquered nations, they did it to humiliate their opponents. They brutally killed them and they removed them, those who survived, and they brought them back as victims to their own country to assimilate them into their culture. And so it puts a lot of pressure on God's people to stand against the influence of this culture. And so what they're trying to do then is to bring people into the land they just conquered, into Judah, or Israel rather, to repopulate with other conquered people groups. And that's really so that basically they're trying to have Israel lose their culture by intermarrying with other cultures, by taking them out of their land. And so it really creates a major identity crisis for God's people. And really, this is the key question that they're asking is how do we live faithfully in exile when we've lost so much? We don't know how to live faithfully without the temple practices, the law. Additionally, as we look ahead, we're going to be encountering kind of the effect of this moment in the story. There's going to be a future ethnic conflict in the New Testament between the Jews and the Samaritans. The Samaritans were really a result of this effect on the northern kingdom that we're going to read about later in the Gospels. But for us, just remember, they're asking the question, how do we live faithfully in exile? Now, leading up to the southern kingdom's exile in 2 Kings 25, Babylon is getting more and more powerful. You see them towards the right with Susa. They're just on the outskirts of the Assyrian Empire. So Assyria to the north is now going to join forces with Egypt to the south to face their mutual enemy of Babylon. And so geographically speaking, Judah is now caught within this major conflict, and it forces their king to respond. So now we're going to look at each king in these last days of God's people and their land, and how the kings influence the story of God's people. And so as Egypt marched north for battle, here we're going to be introduced to King Josiah. Now, he was a good king, and he destroyed paganism. He was reforming Judah, but unfortunately, this is when he died. And so now we see just all these successive kings, and you can notice how short-lived their tenure is. It's very short, so you can kind of creates this tone of just the conflict that's going on. And so as we say goodbye to King Josiah, the next king, King Jehoahaz, he was anti-Egypt, anti-Assyria. And so after Egypt defeated Babylon as they returned home, they took King Jehonahaz with them to Egypt and to replace him with a pro-Egypt king, Jehoiakim. So you can just see all the transition that's going on and just the instability that creates. Now, King Nebuchadnezzar from Babylon defeated Assyria, and so this latest king, Jehoiakim, gets into trouble as he tried to appease both Egypt and Babylon. And so we read about this in 2 Kings 24, 1-2, and this is what starts Daniel. King Nebuchadnezzar invaded Judah to remove the king, who then died in the attack. And then King Nebuchadnezzar deported the elite leaders from Judah, including Daniel, who were forced to relocate in Babylon to start a new life. And so this is now the Babylonian Empire, and you can see how much bigger it's growing. And so we'll show you where they moved to, but you can see towards the right, near Babylon, which is about where Daniel was taken. And so this show of force not only strategically limited a rebellion, but on a spiritual level, it demonstrated Israel's God was powerless to stop them. And so God's people struggled to find any hope. They don't know what their future is going to be. And so it adds weight to their identity crisis. Now it's just not, how do we live faithfully? It's getting worse and worse. So where is God? And so now they're starting to really doubt and question. Now, as this continues on, though, Daniel's assimilating into the Babylonian culture, but back in Jerusalem, Jehoiakim is chosen by the remaining people to replace Jehoiakim as king. And so now we're on to our fourth king. And so his rule is cut short as King Nebuchadnezzar invades a second time, and he's carrying the rest of the royal family. This is skilled laborers, soldiers, religious leaders, and this is where Ezekiel, that we're not going to read about, but the prophet Ezekiel is taken away into exile. And we read about that in 2 Kings 24, 13 to 16. Just see just how all of the resources of Israel from Solomon that we read about, the temple, all of those are carried away. All the officers, the fighting men, the skilled workers, artisans, everyone's removed. And so this creates a greater crisis for the remaining people in Judah that are now under the uncle Zedekiah. And so Zedekiah number 5, he replaced the king. And the challenge here is he's not from the Davidic line. He's not part of that dynasty that's in 2 Samuel 7. And so that promise of a future Messianic king was called into question, which creates more doubt about Israel's future. And so after 9 or so years of loyalty to Babylon, Uncle Zedekiah follows the same family policy by looking to Egypt for help. They continue to look outside of God, which results in the final invasion by Nebuchadnezzar, which you can read about in the culmination of 2 Kings. And this is where we really see the culmination of what led to the exile. The city's besieged for 2 to 3 years. And that's where, as a church going through Lamentations, that's really retelling that part of the story. And so they're besieged for 2 to 3 years until they fell and everything was destroyed, including the temple, the place where God dwelled with his people. And so again, as we're thinking of these questions, it's not just how do we live faithful, where is God, but is God done? Is he no longer committed to his people? And you see this as it's building up towards the end of 2 Kings and the exile. And with all of this backdrop, now we can understand how hopeless it felt for the Jews and how confusing it was to know what it would look like to be a faithful follower in a pagan land where God felt absent and uncaring. They lost their identity as a people, they lost their leadership, they lost their religious practices, and truly without the temple, any hope that God was still committed to them. However, if you remember, we read in Jeremiah, he's the weeping prophet who stayed in Jerusalem amidst all of this conflict. And he lived in Jerusalem during the Babylonian exile, and he called God's people like Daniel. So he's writing to Daniel to bless the world, even in Babylon, so that both God's people and even their enemy would flourish, which is not what God, let me say it again, which is what God had always wanted from his people and from Abraham's descendants, to be that blessing. And so Jeremiah is really speaking hope to look beyond their difficulty. And you see that again in Jeremiah 31. He's prophesying that God would renew their covenant, his covenant with his people. And he's going to do it by transforming their hearts, as Moses promised in Deuteronomy 30. So he's emphasizing that commitment that Moses talked about in Deuteronomy. And notice how it's a new covenant, that the former covenant, and it goes all the way back to Egypt, that the God's people broke that covenant, and he was like a husband to them. Just think of the emotion of that. But now this new covenant, he's going to put the law in their minds. He's going to write it on their hearts. He's going to be their God. They will be my people. What does it say at the end? I will forgive them. I will remember their sins no more. Now, again, as we're moving the story forward, that's going to become very significant in the messaging of Jesus and what he's doing, that forgiveness of sins, that heart transformation. Now, furthermore, Jeremiah also prophesied in Jeremiah 25, 11, and 12, how Israel is only going to be in exile for 70 years. And that gives them hope. It gives them hope that this isn't forever, that it's temporary. And you might be wondering, why is it 70 years? It seems very specific. Well, it's 1 year for every 7 years they didn't follow the law. And part of that was giving the land that God had promised them some rest. And so they never did that. They didn't follow that practice of every 7 years having a Sabbath rest. And so it's basically 1 year for every 7 years. But more than that, what this does, promising that this is going to end, it's good news in a dark time that Israel's sin will not get the final word. The disobedience will not get the final word. The people opposing God's people will not get the final word. God's faithfulness alone will bring about the promise. God will get the final word.